to remember. And so as we begin to talk about this topic, small to great, it's interesting when we think about this. And a decade or two ago, everybody was on fire for this book, just a general business book and just self-development book called Good to Great. And you would hear Good to Great all the time. Well, this isn't from that. This is very different. It's from the standpoint, from a biblical perspective on a topic about how we perceive the environments in which we live and how we perceive when we go in front of the mirror and look at the one staring right back of us at us and how we perceive that. And as we speak about small to great, we have to understand where God fits into the picture. You see, oftentimes we think about things being great, meaning things being large, things being enormous. We think about leaders in the past that others would call great because evidently, based on what we read in the book, they did some historical things, some large, great things. And because of that, their names still exist in some places. Whether it's accurate or not is not the point of this particular message. And so greatness gives an impression that when we look at a great name, we look at a great house and we think, wow, they got it going on because they have a great mansion and the house looks so big, it must be great lifestyle to live in. And so you look online, they have a great following, so they must have it all going. And so many people want to aspire to be like those. I remember one of the times that when Pastor Ken was doing real estate in Maryland, we went to see this house and just to scope it out for some others. And it was, from the road, it was a very large house. Very large, surrounded by woods. But when you go inside, you see that they didn't finish it all. And then you go into the back, it wasn't finished. So from the street, it looked magnificent, great. But when we went inside, we saw that it wasn't quite as great because it wasn't finished and they hadn't done everything else. In fact, something happened, I think their financing or whatever ended, so they couldn't finish it. And so oftentimes we see things that we look at as great or large, and we begin to say, that looks good on the outside. But we don't necessarily know what the truth is. And often we have a perception of what great is. A number of years ago, I can say now, that one of my kids had this college trip they had to go on, not really a trip, but an assignment. And it was at this museum in Baltimore. And so I decided I was going to go, and while they were doing whatever it was they were doing, I was looking around. And as I looked around in this museum, I saw that often they see the armor of the folks who, from the 17th century and all that, came over. And something struck me at that point as I looked at their armor, the helmets and things like that. They looked like they should be in middle school because of the size. They weren't as tall. They were a little bit more vertically challenged. And you think about these things you read in the history book about all these things they've done. And I look at the swords that were with, and everyone's like, that's it? In the movies, they're like this long. But yet, they were like this. And I kept thinking, interesting. And I compared that to a trip I took to Williamsburg one time in Virginia. And you have this old section and all, and you begin to go in the different houses, and they have their armament up. And you realize a lot of the folks were not as tall. But yet the writings and the stories about them made them seem great. And based on that perception of greatness, you're thinking stature. You're thinking all these other things, and it's not that. But in the eyes of those that were around at that time, or the historians who wrote about them, they did great things. You see, oftentimes we think greatness means you've arrived. Greatness means it's wonderful. Greatness means you have everything together. But that's not always the case from a human standpoint. That's why Jesus warned us and told us about, really it is the heart that God looks at. And it's that inside that he cares about. And so when we think about greatness, we can't always rely on our eyes. That's why we walk by faith and not by sight. And so we look at this a little bit deeper, and just because someone said, what? That's a great person, a great name. This person has it going on, or this industry, or these things, but you don't always know whether that's true. Many companies in the past have been characterized as great companies. great things to work for, great places to be, but when you dig into it a little bit more, that may not be the case. Or, for a great analogy, you may have a great house. On the outside, as I mentioned, was great, but the foundation underneath could be crumbling. You have to understand all of this. But what does this have to do from small to great? You see, the way God works, he takes everything from small to great. This is a godly journey. No one bursts onto the scene and all of a sudden they're great, they're magnificent. No one bursts on the scene from day one and they are the be-all, everything. They aren't any of that. And God works from the standpoint of taking something small, something insignificant, and begins to bring it out even further. Great examples? Noah. You never think about Noah from that perspective. But Noah and his family, when Noah got a vision, was told by God what to do. But in all the people that existed, it was just him and his family. But he was consistent in doing something that seemed crazy. Why are you building something that will float on water? It's never rained ever. Why are you building something that's going to flood? We've never had water on the earth like that. We just get a mist that comes up and takes care of things. What are you talking about? You have lost your mind. And so he was insignificant, but yet he focused on the truth that was given to him and did not let the influences externally change his focus. He didn't let what he saw change what already is. Follow me? And so he was walking by faith that what God said was going to come. And so God used him to save, if you will, the remnants of humanity. He used him to be great in that time period. And if it wasn't for God putting that seed of faith in him and him following through, then the results would have been a little bit different. Think about Abraham, or in this case, Abram. Everyone says he was great, is a great name, but he didn't start out great. He was insignificant. But God called him out from his family. He called him out from another country. He called him out and just wanted him to believe and then decide to walk. Where was he going? He had no idea because he'd never been that way before. And he kept walking. And even as he walked, he trusted God. And even though everyone else around him, there were great nations that were around him. There were great people according to what societies would say. But yet, he was greater because God was with him. And so he took someone insignificant and eventually made him great and gave him a promise to which many people owe their current existence to the promise that God made to him. You see, this is how God works. One more example that's very easy to remember. David versus Goliath. Goliath was very tall. Not only skinny tall, but breath-wise, big. David was not. David was a shepherd boy. All David knew was being on the backside of the mountain taking care of sheep. But it was in that time he nurtured his relationship with the Lord. He began to play well. He began to sing. He began to compose because he had all that free time. And then when he got challenged by the lion and the bear, he instinctively knew based on the direction of the Lord just to go and take care of that himself. So he had no fear. And so he went ahead day to day, moment to moment, with no fear, just trusting that God would save him and keep him. And eventually this insignificant boy, who even his family overlooked, who he didn't even realize who he was, but this boy was brought forth at the fullness of time, and it was anointed to be the king, a great person. A person that learned to have a heart after God's own heart. How does this change things? Small to great. People want to be great in their life, but I would say you have to understand how to be small first. People want to be significant, but you got to understand how to be insignificant first. It is in that process of going from small to great do you begin to achieve the things that you didn't even know that you could or wanted to achieve. Because it's in the smallness that you begin to strip away all of the external influences, and you begin to look at the one who can only save you, the one who can only deliver you, and you learn to depend on him. Never look down at yourself because no one realizes that you're there. Never feel discouraged because everyone's celebrating everyone around you but not you. But if you're steadfast and movable, always about the things of God, you will find out that he will elevate you at the right time. Smallness is great because it lets you deal with you. And in that smallness, you better take advantage of that time. In that smallness is when you get to compose your music to the Lord. It is in that smallness you begin to celebrate every little thing. If you ever been to the point of still being hungry, you had your meal, but you had no money for anything else, and you realize that you can be creative. What do you have in the house? You got bread, you got something else, and you begin to make a meal that ends up being really good. But it's in that smallness. If you've never been there, you don't appreciate it. And if you've gone too far into greatness before you've been small, when the challenges come, your foundations crumble. It is in the smallness that all of these things happen. We as people, as humankind, not just us individually that are here, is that it's more of the understanding of what it means to be small to great. Never despise things that are small. Right. Because those things are the things that God will enlarge. With a little bit of mustard seed, you begin to see large results. With the planting in the ground of whatever you have is when you get and yield the results that he has for you. One quick aside, I keep on going in this message. I always tell people too, and this deals with the phrase that people don't like to hear, but it deals with giving. I tell you, you always should give. You always should give. Even if you're not at a tithing point, you should give. Because you're planting seed. And you can't always expect the harvest if you've never put anything in. You have to put in what you have. And I always tell people, whatever you can put it in. And then God begins to release other blessings. It's important. But that's another whole message. Speaking of small, I want to talk for a minute and just give you just an update on, not an update, but just understanding. You see, we all know, and I've said this before, that, you heard of the Apostle Paul, or Saul, from a Hebrew perspective. And really it turns out that if you translate that, it deals with small. That's kind of, people assume that's part of the stature of him. But no one knows for sure. I was reading and doing some research recently, and I came across this one little tidbit that I'll share with you just for additional understanding. There was a book in the late 2nd century that was written in it, and this person describes the Apostle Paul as a man of small stature with a bald head and crooked legs, because evidently it was shared one to another. So this is the next century after Paul passed, that they were talking about and writing down what he looked like. So Paul came, and if he had a bald head and crooked legs, with eyebrows meeting and a nose somewhat hooked, is what it said. Paul himself reports that his critics say his bodily presence was weak and his speech was of no account, meaning that he would come in presence of people and he wasn't the greatest preacher. He wasn't the imposing figure that would stand there. But God anointed the small because he tore down what was prematurely great and made him into what was truly great. And so they talk about that, and Paul even alludes to it in 2 Corinthians 10:10. I'm not turning there, but where he talks about people are looking at him, just looking at him and saying, who is this guy that writes these letters that are so forceful, so impassionate? And so then it goes on and says, So Paul's physical weakness is epitomized by the thorn in the flesh, which you've heard. And so the thorn in the flesh could mean anything. If this description is even correct, he could have been suffering from any kind of disease. But if you saw somebody walking in like that, right, and you think, oh, who is this? And he's going to come out and talk to me? In fact, I've heard better preachers than him. Who is he? But his revelation was second to none. The commitment was second to none. Because God took something small and developed into something great. Let me give you one more real quick story, then I'm going to go deeper into this. Pastor Kim and I used to be part of a gospel choir in college. I remember, there was this, I can't remember the song, but people were auditioning for leads, lead vocal points. I'm sure Deacon Shirley, you could have been a lead in one of those songs, right? She's like, no, not me. And so in it, they were coming, and so this lady, this time, I said girl at the time, but she was a woman, she was in college. She comes up, and everybody was like, oh yeah, she can sing, because she had the outward appearance of someone who could really just, as we would say, blow. And so we got up there, the music was playing, everybody was anticipating, oh yeah, this is going to be good. And she's going to just go deep. And her voice came out, it was almost like a mouse. Everybody was like, this whole thing. Because she looked on the outside like she was going to blow like that. She had the structure and the appearance that she was going to do, but yet the appearance was deceiving. Very sweet lady. Very sweet. But the voice wasn't what everybody thought, and everyone was in shock for a minute. Then everyone did it like this at the end. But you can't always tell the book by its cover. So you never make assumptions about things that are small or things that are starting out. I want to remind you about the physical part that we don't really focus on. Let's look at Philippians chapter 3 for a minute, verse 7 through 11. And I just want to also tell you, from the standpoint, whatever God has called you to do, if you're in that small phase, don't despise it. If you look in the mirror and you feel insignificant, it isn't always about your feelings. If people keep telling you that you are not able, capable, no one in your family's ever done this, so be bold enough to say, but that's okay. Because in my new family, the God family, that the family of God, He's the one that empowers, He's the one that opens doors, He's the one that elevates. And so now He can work in this small that you all call me, but yet in the end I'm going to be great. But I'm going to be great for Him because He is the one that lifts me up. So never despise small beginnings. Never despise where you are. But understand that greatness is in you if you let Him build the greatness. And so here we go where Paul is talking, the one I just described. He's getting a point across. In verse 7 it says, "For what things were gain to me, these I have counted loss for Christ. Yet indeed, I also count all things lost for the excellence of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I had suffered the loss of all things, and count them as rubbish, that I may gain Christ, and be found in Him, not having my own righteousness, which is from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness which is from God by faith, that I may know Him and the power of His resurrection and the fellowship of His suffering, being conformed to His death, if by any means I may attain to the resurrection from the dead." What he's saying here, summarizing it, is that, look, everything that I gained, because before that he was bragging about his background. And he's like, I was the Hebrew of Hebrews. I went to the best schools. I did this. I was so far ahead of everybody else. I was zealous about following God. I was so focused. I was this. I achieved this before anybody else. And all he was doing was talking about his accolades that he compared to others. And so he was talking about all that because that was, at one point, important to him. At one point, he thought that's what greatness was. At one point, he figured that's how everyone should be measured. But then he brings it back around and says, but you know what? All of that is rubbish. It means absolutely nothing compared to knowing Jesus. Knowing him, meaning experiencing him, understanding him, seeing what he is really doing. And so all of that greatness didn't stay long because it was broken down, and then I had to start from small to become great. And all of the greatness came because of his grace. All of the greatness came based on the way he was leading me and empowering me and revealing me to himself to me. This is what he's conveying. And he's like, because of all of that, the knowledge of him and the experience of him, then he also attains to eternal life, resurrection. He also begins to know more and more. God chose a broken vessel who didn't know he was broken and broke him down and rebuilt him from small to great. I want to say this to you because there are too many people that have given up because they don't see themselves as great, because everyone has said they're not great. Or they look at what they see, TV, media, whatever, or in their neighborhoods, and these people are declared great, and they don't look anything like them. That is not your measuring stick. God takes the humble, the small, and begins to work and mold and build up. Greatness is given through him. Greatness comes through submission. Greatness comes through Jesus alone.